Today, we are going to discuss something difficult but vital: how regular German citizens came to support Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. Many people believe Hitler took power by force alone, but the reality is more complex and more troubling. But before we can understand why so many Germans rallied Hitler, we need to examine the desperate state Germany was in before he came to power. I'm Miguel, and this is what I learned today. After World War I, Germany was left broken. The Treaty of Versailles placed full blame for the war on Germany, forcing to pay crippling reparations to the Allied powers. This devastated the economy. Ordinary Germans saw their savings disappear overnight as the country's currency, the mark, lost its value. In the early 1980s, Germany experienced one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history. Imagine this: a loaf of bread that cost just 1 mark 1918 suddenly cost billions of marks by 1923. People carried their wages in wheelbarrows, only to find that by the time they could spend it, it wasn't worth anything. Families couldn't afford basic necessities, and many were left hungry and homeless. This is a quote by Elsie Wendell, a social worker at the time, and I quote: "People were starving, children were malnourished. I saw families pawning everything they had just to buy food. The inflation destroyed any sense of stability." Even as inflation slowed in the 1920s, Germany's economy didn't have a chance to recover before the global financial system collapsed again during the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through Germany. Millions lost their jobs, and almost overnight. By 1932, nearly 6 million Germans, about 1 in 3, were unemployed. The situation was dire, and with businesses failing, poverty rose sharply. To make matters worse, the political system was chaotic. The Weimar Republic, which governed Germany at the time, was fragile, constantly changing leaders and unable to unite the country. The political parties were divided, and this left many Germans feeling hopeless, turning to more extreme solutions. It was during this time that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to rise. Hitler used this economic desperation to his advantage. He promised to restore Germany to its former greatness, blaming the country's troubles on the Treaty of Versailles, communists and Jews. His message offered hope to people who felt abandoned by their government and humiliated by Germany's defeat. For people suffering through economic collapse and national humiliation, Hitler's promises were hard to resist. And I quote again Elsie Wendell, the social worker I mentioned earlier. "We wanted to believe in something, anything that could make our lives better. Hitler seemed to have the answers." End quote. But the consequences of those promises were terrible, as we know now. As Hitler gained more support, he began to implement policies that benefited certain Germans at the expense of others. Blaming minorities for the country's problems, it became easier for many Germans to overlook what was happening to their Jewish neighbors, especially when their own lives were improving. This is how ordinary people, worn down by years of suffering and economic hardship, found themselves supporting a regime that would soon commit some of the worst atrocities in human history. Then Hitler's government started making changes. They created job-building roads and factories. Young men who had been unemployed were now earning money again. The government gave loans to newlywed couples and to help them start families. But they built new houses and schools. To understand how powerful these changes felt, listen to what Elsie Wendell, a social worker, said, and I quote: People who had been begging on the streets were suddenly working. Families who couldn't feed their children now had food on the table. Many Germans started to believe that Hitler was some kind of miracle worker. But it wasn't just about money. After losing World War I, many Germans felt humiliated. Their country had lost important territories, other nations looked down on them. Hitler promised to make Germany strong and respected again. Sound familiar? He rebuilt the German military, even though this was forbidden by international treaties. Instead of feeling ashamed, many Germans started to feel proud of their country again. This economic recovery, renewed national pride, came with a terrible price. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on Jewish people and other minorities. As conditions improved for many Germans, they found it easier to ignore what was happening to their Jewish neighbors. Some even started believing Hitler's lies about them. Wilhelm Huebner was a teenager during this time, later remembered, and I quote, "When you saw your father working again, your mother able to buy food again, it was easy to believe everything else Hitler said. We didn't want to question where this prosperity came from or who was paying the price for it." One of the most powerful ways Hitler kept control was through young people. The Hitler Youth wasn't just a club, it was a way to create loyal followers. Young people were taught to put Hitler before everything else, even their own families. But as the war progressed, some Germans began to see the terrible truth behind Hitler's promises. One of the most powerful stories comes from Trauding Junger, who worked as Hitler's secretary during the final years of the war. Her story shows how ordinary people slowly woke up to the horror they had supported. And I quote, "I was 22 years old when I became Hitler's secretary. I thought I was at the center of something great, but we all did. Later, I realized I had been part of something terrible. The worst part was understanding that I could have known earlier. The information was there, but we chose not to see it." End quote. Alex von der Bische, who served as an officer at the Eastern Front, later revealed how knowledge of the mass killings spread. People knew. Maybe not everything, but they knew. They saw their Jewish neighbors disappear, they saw the trains, they smelled the smoke from the camps, but they told themselves it couldn't be what they feared. Or they said, "What can we do?" It was easier to look away. End quote. By 1944, as German cities burned under Allied bombings and millions had died, many Germans finally began to question their support. Henrietta von Schizjak, one of Hitler's oldest associates, tells us about the myth she confronted Hitler about the deportation of Jews she had witnessed in Amsterdam. And I quote, "When I told Hitler what I had seen, he became angry. He said I was being too sentimental. He said that while thousands of German soldiers were dying every day, the Jews had to be eliminated. That's when I finally understood. There was no greater good, no noble cause. It was just pure evil." End quote. After the war, Trauding Junger dedicated her life to speaking with young people. Her message was powerful. I tell this story to young people because I want them to understand how easy it is to become part of something terrible while thinking you're doing the right thing. When you're young, you think you know everything. You think you can judge what's right and wrong. But I tell them, if you find yourself in a system where speaking up means risking your life, it's already too late. You have to recognize the warning signs early. You have to speak up before the system becomes too strong. And Gunther Treadway, who was just a schoolboy in Dusseldorf during the war, put it this way, I quote, "People ask how we let it happen, but what's the wrong question? The right question is, how do you make sure you would recognize it happening today? Because it never starts with concentration camps. It starts with small choices. Choosing comfort over conscience, security over morality, us versus." Before we end today's episode, here are 5 takeaways from these powerful testimonies. First, economic desperation made people vulnerable to extremist solutions. When Hitler appeared to fix Germany's economic problems, many people were willing to overlook his darker actions. Secondly, support for the regime wasn't mainly based on fear. In 1936, around 90% of Germans supported the Nazi government because they believed it was improving their lives. Thirdly, the Nazi regime gained power gradually through small compromises that made choosing personal comfort over moral concerns. Fourthly, most Germans knew about the persecution of Jews and other minorities, but chose to look away, showing how not wanting to know can make us complicit in terrible events. And fourthly, by the time people recognized or realized the full horror of what they had supported, the system was too powerful to resist, teaching us that we must recognize this extremism in early strict stages. Guys, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Miguel, and this is what I learned today. Don't forget to subscribe.